Hello and welcome to week 6 of our Applied Food Science course. Hope you're excited, hope you're hungry, because today we're talking about glorious, glorious meat. So, the same question we always start with is, what is meat? Well, lean meat is basically just three things, three of our basic food molecules. First and foremost, it is about 75% this guy, water. H2O, dihydrogen monoxide, however you want to spin it, it's mostly water, which makes sense because meat is from animals and plants, living things are mostly water. So check on the water. What else do we got in here? Well, we've got some protein. Remember, proteins, there's a whole bunch of different types of protein, but they're the basic building blocks that make us up, all the different parts of us from, our skin to our hair. It's mainly protein. So meat is about 20% protein, which may not sound like a lot, but consider in the grand scheme of things, when things are mostly water, 20% is actually a big deal. So that's why we say that meats are such a high source of protein, because they're mostly protein other than being water. And the final little thing we've got in there is some fat. Now, animal fat is, of course, usually saturated. That is to say, it doesn't have any little extra kinks in there. What happens with saturated fat, of course, is that they can stack on top of each other, and that's why animal fats are usually solid, because they stack together so well. They don't have those kinks to keep them floating around and separate. And that's also why a lot of people say, you don't want to eat too much lean meat, because there is fat. While it's only about 3% of the overall makeup, it's still a good portion of the actual substance that you're consuming, and this is the stuff that's going to raise your cholesterol, specifically the bad kind, the HDL, the LDL, and you don't want that, right? Now that everything's made up of our 4 basic food proteins, or food molecules. The one that we're kind of missing here are carbohydrates. Yes, there are some carbohydrates in there, but it's really so few and far between that we don't usually consider them when we're talking about meat. Right? When you think meat, you don't think sweet, really, because there's not a lot. Remember, carbohydrates are that energy molecule, and meat mainly gets its energy from fat, and we'll talk about why in just a second, but just in case you were thinking that. So, if we know what it's made of, what makes it unique? What does it look like? Well, it looks something like this. Okay, maybe almost nothing like this, but stick with me here. Let's talk about the different parts of this, okay? So we've got, you see these long branches, right? These are the equivalent of our muscle cells. So all animals have muscles. You've got muscles. I've got muscles. Every movement we make is because of a muscle. And muscle cells are actually really long and skinny. In fact, if you look at your arm, there are muscle cells that go the entire length of your forearm, which for a cell is a huge distance because most of them are super, super tiny. Now, what else do we have going on in here? Well, you can see we've got these little black bands on the end. These are what are called connective tissue. And essentially the job of connective tissue, while there's a few cells in there, it's mainly stuff like this glue almost that these cells secrete. And all it does is it holds everything together, right? Which is a great thing because you don't want your muscles flopping off your bones or falling apart, right? So connective tissue is very important. Maybe not as much good eats, but we'll get into that in a second. Now, the last thing we've got here, we've got these little yellow blobs in here, and as you may have guessed, those are the fat cells, or fat globules in there. And mostly, muscles' only energy source is fat. Why? Well, remember on our first lecture when we were talking about the different kinds of food molecules, we said that fat is the most energy dense of our food molecules. It has about 7 calories per gram, whereas say carbohydrates is only 4 calories per gram. So what's really nice about having this fat rather than carbohydrates as our energy source is that you have got a lot more energy taking up a lot less space. And that's good when you've got muscles that need to be constantly able to move. It's going to be bad news if you ever run out of energy. So you better have something that's got a lot of it packed in there, right? Okay, so we've got our muscles. And this is essentially what meat is, okay? Well, you might be thinking to yourself, but I know about different types of meat. I've heard that there's red meat, and I've heard that there's white meat. What's up with that? Well, that's actually, they're the same basic makeup. They're going to be long muscle cells, there's going to be connective tissue, and there's going to be little bits of fat in there. But the big difference is in what they're meant to do. So, red muscles are this way because of a protein called myoglobin. Now, myoglobin is a lot like hemoglobin, if you know what that is. Hemoglobin is the stuff in our blood that carries oxygen all over our body. It's what makes blood red. And myoglobin is actually what makes red meat red. Myoglobin just holds on to oxygen because I'm sure if, when you work out, right, you're working your muscles, you end up breathing really heavy. Why? Because you need lots of oxygen in your muscles. Well, how does the oxygen stay there? It's because of myoglobin. Myoglobin essentially grabs onto that oxygen and really holds it in tight. That's also why if you've ever had a really nice fresh cut of meat and you've cut into it, it looks kind of purple in there at first because when myoglobin doesn't have oxygen, it'll turn purple. Or if, say, you've got a steak and it sits in the freezer for a really long time, it'll turn brown. Why is that? It's because when myoglobin loses that oxygen, it's got a little iron atom in there, and sometimes that oxygen can steal electrons away from that iron. Don't worry about super grasping everything I'm saying as far as the atoms and stuff. Just know that essentially myoglobin is red when it has oxygen. And then if that oxygen gets taken away or used up by the meat, it'll turn purple or brown. But it's not hard to fix, right? If you just expose it to air, usually it'll get back to that beautiful red that we love in our red meat. But like I said, what is it? What is the function of it? Well, red meat is usually from muscles that are continuously used. That is to say, for example, a cow. A cow stands a lot. It doesn't do a lot other than that. It walks a little bit. But while it's standing, those muscles in its arms and legs are continuously flexed. They're continuously used, and they're used at very slow and monotonous paces. That's what gives you red meat. What about white meat? White meat is actually designed more for short, quick bursts of speed. So the white meat you probably immediately think of as a chicken breast. Why? Well, because think about chickens. Whenever they're using their breast muscles to flap their wings, they're not doing that for very long. It's very much a, get out of here. I got to run away from the farmer or the little kid trying to chase me. And it uses those really quick. What that means is it doesn't need this sustained oxygen level that red meat cells do. And so it doesn't have nearly as much need of that myoglobin. So it's a lot of, you don't have that beautiful red color. The other thing, though, and why white meat is usually considered a little sweeter, is while white meat uses fat, its main energy source is carbohydrates, or sugars, right? And so the reason white meat is usually a little sweeter is because it's for really fast, intense motion. Whereas, say, the legs of the chicken are used constantly for standing around and walking. They're used way more often at a much more continual pace, and thus there's a lot more red meat. Now, red and white meat aren't exclusive. You can have mixtures of red and white meat in some things. A great example would be duck meat. If you've ever had duck meat, you wouldn't call it red meat, you wouldn't call it white meat, it's somewhere in between. That's because ducks are migratory, and they constantly use their breast muscles to flap their wings. And so, while yes, they might use them for quick little bursts, and so they've got some white muscle cells in there, they also have these red muscle cells for long, continuous flights. So, it's not a black or, well, I guess red or white situation. There are shades of pink, if you will. So, moving on. So, what do each of these different cells do when it comes to cooking, right? What is the application here? Well, most of your meat, when you cook it, is going to be these muscle cells. And they're long, and they're supposed to be really tough, right? You want your muscles to be tough. If they weren't tough, again, you'd fall apart. You'd be some, all flabby and nonsense. So muscle cells are naturally very tough, okay? So when we cook meat, one of the first things we're trying to do is essentially thicken these things up enough that we can bite through it. If you've ever bitten into like really raw meat, it's very chewy because these things are very resilient. They're very spongy, if you will. Okay, they're meant to bend and not break, right? Which is good, right? You wouldn't want to poke your muscle and all of a sudden there's a hole in your arm. Oh, that's not good, right? So muscle cells themselves, they're very chewy, they're very elastic. And so one of the reasons we cook meat, right, is to essentially harden these things up just a little bit. We want the proteins in there to kind of firm up and grab onto each other enough that when we bite it, we can actually tear through it rather than just kind of bouncing off. Now, fat is one of the most wonderful qualities of meat because, I don't know if you could tell, but I've represented the fat here with little bits of crayon. This is just a yellow crayon, and that's on purpose because what happens when a crayon gets hot? That's right, it melts. Very good, I knew you were smart. Fat does the same thing in muscles. It's gonna melt, and what that does is it gives it this really nice moist flavor to it, right? Our mouths can't really tell the difference between liquids, and so liquid fat is good one way or the other, right? The other thing it's gonna do is lubricate this up. When this is just a hunk of meat, all these muscle fibers are very tightly packed together. This is going to kind of lubricate them up and allow them to start kind of moving around each other as it starts to melt. Lastly, we have the connective tissue. Now, the connective tissue can often be the most difficult part to deal with because it is easily the chewiest part. Okay? If you've ever gotten a real bad piece of like gristle in your steak, that's probably mostly connective tissue, and that is nasty stuff. Okay, because it really has no flavor. It's just like chewing on a rubber band, and ew. Okay. That said, there are some ways we can deal with that. The main way is that collagen, which is the main type of connective tissue. Okay, collagen is just the name for this stuff. The cool thing about collagen is if you get it hot enough, it will actually dissolve and break down into gelatin, which, as we know, can be very delicious and give foods almost a custardy taste. So if you've ever had just really, really good filet mignon, for example, and it's got that kind of buttery quality to it, that texture that's almost custard-like, it's because you might have collagen melting down into a little gelatin. Probably not, I guess not as much with the filet mignon, but if you've ever had like a really good barbecue, a lot of that is that gelatin in there, and we love that. It's so good. If you've ever had made like a pork roast or done like a roast beef and then put it in the freezer overnight, you'll come back and there'll be this kind of layer of jello-ish stuff on there. That's just a combination of the fat and the collagen re-solidifying, but it's gelatiny now, so that's fine. The point is, it doesn't taste like a rubber band anymore, and that's what we want. So, When we're talking about meat, though, right, what makes meat special? Mostly, it's the incredibly distinct flavor that you get out of meat that you don't get anywhere else. Where does that come from? Well, as it turns out, the muscle cells are pretty set in stone. They don't vary their chemical their chemical makeup very much. And same thing with the connective tissue, with the rubber bands, if you will. They're not going to taste one way or the other. So where does the flavor come from? You guessed it, process of elimination. It's the fat. As it turns out, these fat cells, as well as being great energy, they're storage units, right? They just collect stuff. Mostly it's fat, but it's also where all that flavor is. So for me, I love the taste of lamb. For me, there is no meat that is better than lamb. And the reason is because from a lamb's diet, you get a lot of those flavor compounds end up stored in the fat. And that's why, for me, I'm always usually a little hesitant when I'm at the grocery store and I see the pre-trimmed steaks, and I like to do, my own butchery to some extent, because I usually think that a lot of those butchers, when they're cleaning up like a nice rump roast, they take way too much of the fat off it. That's where the flavor's at. Okay, don't be afraid of it. Okay, like we said, a lot of it will melt down. It'll lube it up, but it'll leave that flavor, and that's what you want. Okay, don't be afraid. Okay, fat is okay in small portions, and it's where the taste is at. Right. So if we know what meat is made of, and there's some good stuff in it, we've talked a little bit about why you cook it, but really when we talk about meat, there's 4 reasons that we're ever going to cook meat. The first and foremost is we want to be safe. Everybody's terrified of raw meat, right? Oh, all the bacteria, the disease that's on there. Hold up. Let's just talk about this for a second, okay? Where is the danger in raw meat? Well, it's from the bacteria that love what meat is made of. And rightly so. There's lots of good stuff there that the bacteria can eat. But let's stop and consider for a second how that bacteria gets there. A lot of people are under the assumption that there's just bacteria in the meat, and that's wrong. Okay, think about it. Meat is just a muscle. If you had bacteria just like in your muscles, that would not be good at all. Cows are the same way. They can't live if they're, disease-ridden muscles. So the bacteria actually comes from outside once the cow is butchered, and you get it moving through all of these places where there is bacteria. So the point I'm trying to make here is when you're concerned about, say, cooking a steak to rare, don't worry as much, because the bacteria that we're trying to kill is actually on the outside of that steak. Unless you've had it sitting out for 10 days in your kitchen, chances are bacteria is just going to be on the surface. Okay, so moving forward as we talk about different safety and things, just something to keep in mind. Now, the second reason we cook it, and we've already talked about this, is we need to be able to chew this. Okay? If these muscle cells are still in their raw form, they're incredibly flexible and rubbery and really hard to chew through. Okay? A note on that real fast. When you cook a steak, you might hear some people get really uppity about how you cut that steak. And, honestly, when I was younger, I used to think that all the time. Why do people care how the steak is cut? It doesn't matter. You're just going to eat it. Actually, not totally true. Let's think about this for a second. Meat has what we call a grain, and the grain is simply what direction these muscle cells go. If you've ever seen a piece of meat, you've probably seen that there's definite lines to it. The best example I can give is if you've ever gotten one of those rotisserie chickens, right, and they're just delicious. They peel them apart. When you grab part of the breast there and you peel it, it's going to tear off along a line. It doesn't just zigzag all over the place. That line is the grain of the meat. So when you cut meat, you have 2 options. You can either cut it with the grain or across the grain. Now, cutting it across the grain is infinitely better, and I'll tell you why. Because when you take this and you cut it across the grain, what you're doing is you're taking these muscle fibers and you're putting them in smaller packages. So, consider this. This would be like if you cut it with the grain. Long, stringy, ugh. But what if you cut it across the grain? You would end up with something like this. Now, what's beautiful about this is when you put it in your mouth and you take a bite, all those muscle fibers are just going to come pouring out of there, and you're going to have that meaty goodness without any of that chewiness that comes from trying to cut through the muscle fibers. Way better to do it with a knife than your teeth. Pretty good, right? Okay, so third reason we cook meat is to digest it. You've probably never thought of this, but digestion actually starts as soon as you take a bite of something. Most of our digestion happens right here, right? You've got saliva. It's got enzymes that break things down. You chew things to break it down. If you just swallowed your food whole, it would take forever to digest anything. So when we cook something, we're actually pre-digesting it. Right? We're taking some of the proteins and the fat and those fibers, and we're breaking them apart. It makes it easier for us to digest. There are actually some anthropologists that think that our appendix was actually once needed to digest raw meat before we knew how to cook. That now it's all shriveled up and useless, but that just goes to show the importance that cooking plays in digestion. We needed a whole organ just to digest meat. So it was very important. And the final thing, and probably the one that's on most of our minds, is flavor. Because let me tell you, when we go to cook meat, we go to Flavor Town. So let's talk about it, right? Well, here's an interesting thing to think about. There are lots of delicacies out there that call for raw meat. If you've ever had, say, beef carpaccio or a steak tartare, that's raw meat. And what's interesting is that it tastes a lot different than cooked meat. Why? Right? Well, first off, let's go back to the safety thing, because again, safety is a huge issue. And I definitely want to start by saying, if you ever don't feel comfortable doing something because you think it might make you sick, do not do that thing. Okay? Personally, I'm a huge fan of beef carpaccio, especially. I think it's just incredibly subtle and delicate. But the reason that works is because you cut beef carpaccio super thin. And so the amount of that beef that was on the outside of that steak is so incredibly tiny, it's barely worth being concerned about, right? Most of the area of that is from the inside where there aren't microbes, okay? But the raw meat is so different than the cooked meat. And most culinary scientists define this difference by saying that raw, uncooked beef is tasty. That is to say, you're not going to really experience it until you put it in your mouth, you put it on your taste buds. Whereas cooked meat is what we call flavorful. Now, flavorful is the idea that there is an aroma as well as a taste, which makes sense. If you've ever cooked meat, and I'm sure even if you're a vegetarian, you've smelled it, there's a distinct aroma to it, and personally, I just love it. So what happens when we cook the meat? All right? Well, now, the different stages of cooking meat that we're familiar with, right? And you go into a restaurant, you might order your steak raw. So what is that? Well, raw meat is around 120 degrees internal temperature. So that is to say, at the center of that steak, it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, what's wonderful about that is that the proteins have started to squeeze together because you're cooking them. And when they squeeze together, they squeeze out that water. That water just can't stay in there anymore. And so it gets out of those proteins squeezing together. And that is what we call juicy, because you start to get this water being able to escape, and so you get this juiciness to it. Now, at the same time, those proteins coming together are going to become firm, which lets us bite through it. Okay, so moving up that scale, you've got about 140 is about medium, and obviously 130 in between there would be about medium rare. That's personally how I like my steaks. But 140 medium, okay? At this point, essentially all of your proteins are really squeezing out the water. So this is where you're going to get a lot of that red, juicy drippings. So if you've ever pulled off a steak and there's just red juice flowing from it, it's because all of those proteins have squeezed the water right out of there, okay? This is usually, it's a little pink inside still, right? Because the myoglobin in there hasn't denatured yet. Myoglobin denatures and just turns to this kind of gray color around 160 degrees, which is what we consider well done. Now, the thing about well done that's good is bacteria cannot survive above 160 degrees. So if you get your steak up to 160 degrees, without a doubt, that thing is bacteria free. Good. But it's probably also texture and taste free as well, in my opinion. So when you're cooking, right, depending on how you like it, I personally like it more on the raw side. A lot of times, as we said, the reason people don't like their meat on the raw side is because they say that it's dangerous or it's not cooked all the way through. Well, yeah, it's not. But consider, the bacteria is on the outside. And one of the beautiful things about cooking meat is that inevitably you are going to have the outside at a higher temperature than the inside. It's nearly impossible to cook a steak all the way through without like sous videing it to say 140 degrees without really searing the outside, which again is actually a good thing, because when you sear that steak, you get the Maillard reaction happening, right? You've got proteins, you've got carbohydrates, they're caramelizing, they're browning, and you get that beautiful crust that not only makes it safe to eat because you've baked the outside of it, but it also adds that nice beautiful flavor and gives it that intoxicating aroma. So final thing I want to talk about is really what's the best meat to get, right? Well, here's the one thing to think about. Even though red meat is all red meat, not all red meat is created equal, okay? You have to think about when it's used. Typically, the more often a muscle is used, the more tough it's going to be, the less tender it is. Okay, that's why when you get like a Boston butt or something, right, like a shoulder roast, that thing is so much connective tissue because it gets used all the time. And those really tend to lend themselves to low, slow cooking applications that may get up to that 160 degree mark. But at that mark, if you keep it there for long enough, the connective tissue starts to break down and you get that beautiful gelatin. But a lot of people say if you want to cook, at high heat for a short time, you want muscles that are more inactive, right? For cows, of course, it's the tenderloin. It's named after tender, right? Because it's up their back. And cows, they really don't use their back muscles very often. They don't need to, right? We need to because we're upright, but they don't, okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about is old versus young. Not since the animal is slaughtered, but do you go for a veal or a calf or an old cow or an old sheep? Well, it's totally personal preference. Let's talk first about fat. Remember, fat is our storage molecule of the meat, right? So essentially, as these things go through their life, they're going to pick up tons of flavors. So the older things are, the more of that innate flavor is going to be there. For things like sheep, we usually like younger sheep. We like lamb because they concentrate that flavor really fast. If you've ever had mutton, which is just meat from an older sheep, it can be overpowering, that lamminess, if you will. Now, cows, on the other hand, are actually kind of the other end. Young cow meat really just hasn't had time to absorb any of that flavor. That's why when you go for a cow, you want something older. But again, the older they are, the more active they have been, and so the tougher that meat is going to be. Similar is collagen, right? Our connective tissue, our rubber band of the muscle. Okay, when animals are younger, this collagen is much more susceptible to breaking down and dissolving into gelatin. Okay, so if you want a really nice, for example, pulled pork sandwich, you're going to want to get pork from a really young cow because pig, because that collagen is going to melt a lot easier. Okay, and again, going back to the activity, and this really applies, the older the animal, inevitably, the more connective tissue they will have, because they've been more active, and the more active you are, the more important it is to keep all that stuff together. So, what do we learn? Okay, we've got red meat, we've got white meat, we've got connective tissue, we've got our muscle cells, and we've got our fat in there, each with their own unique flavors and attributes to them. We talked about why we cook things, to make it safe, to make it easy to chew, make it easy to digest, and for the flavor, of course. We talked about how raw meat is tasty, whereas cooked meat is flavorful. That raw meat is usually around 120 degrees. It's firm but juicy. 140 degrees is our medium. It's really juicy, but it's starting to dry out a little bit. And at 160 degrees, you have a well-done steak that might not be good at first, but if you cook it long enough, the collagen can dissolve, and you'll have a delicious, moist piece of meat. The best meat depends on your preference. The younger it is, inevitably, the more tender it is, and the less flavor it will have. Whereas older, while it might have more flavor, it's also going to have a lot more connective tissue, be a lot tougher. And that goes for any active or inactive muscle as well. Keep your eye out for the bonus round to find out about your lab this week, and hope to see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye.